Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to another episode of the No-Huddle Show. Joe Giglio with you this week. Elliot and Matt have been doing a great job with all the daily podcasts and the debate from Eagles camp. I'm with you this week. Last time I talked to you, I had Merrill Reese on, the voice of the Eagles, and we were previewing the season. And the one thing that we thought about this team that was going to be one of their strengths was how deep they were going to be at wide receiver. We were worried about the corners. Well, since the last time I talked to you, things have changed. The Eagles made a trade, as everyone knows by now. Jordan Matthews is gone. A third-round pick is gone. Ronald Darby, cornerback from the Buffalo Bills, has arrived. I am not as on board with it as everybody else. I think it could be a good deal, but I do have some reservations about trading away a good player in Matthews, and we'll see what Ronald Darby can become. Certainly going to be the Eagles' number one corner this year. I thought for this episode to bring some perspective on Ronald Darby and maybe some outside thoughts as well on Jordan Matthews and what kind of player just left the Eagles. A guy who covers the Buffalo Bills for Syracuse.com and New York Upstate, Matthew Fairburn, joining us right now on the No-Huddle Show. How you doing, Matthew?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. What was your reaction? Eagles fans were, I think, excited. I think for the most part, Philadelphia Eagles fans were really happy with this trade when it went down, mostly because they got a corner and they thought Matthews wasn't needed as much on this team. What was your first gut reaction a little less than a week ago now when you heard about this deal?
Yeah, I think the first reaction was shock, because this wasn't an isolated move for the Bills. They didn't just trade Ronald Darby for Jordan Matthews. They had also traded Sammy Watkins to the Los Angeles Rams. And, those were two moves that really changed the foundation of this franchise and altered the course of, the next few seasons for them. So it was definitely a bit of a shock, but it helped make sense of the Sammy Watkins trade, when they went out and got Jordan Matthews and traded away Ronald Darby. I would say, I liked this move for the Bills a lot, better than I liked the Sammy Watkins trade for the Bills. I think both were fine moves, but I particularly liked the move to get Jordan Matthews to help ease the loss of Watkins. And, getting rid of Ronald Darby to some was tough to swallow, but after the way he took a bit of a step back last season, I think, there was reason to believe he was expendable in this secondary long term, especially after they spent a first-round pick on Tre'Davious White. So I think, they came out slight winners in this deal, but, as a total package, they were two very risky moves that, Brandon Beane deserves credit for at least sticking his neck out there and, giving the Bills something to look forward to down the line. But in the short term, they definitely took a hit on their roster talent-wise.
It's funny the way you described the new Bills GM and just the way this trade was and maybe an expendable player. I feel like Howie Roseman and Beane probably were on the same wavelength, and they just had to find common ground here because it felt like Matthews was expendable to the Eagles long-term. Darby, the same thing. I want to ask you about Darby. Let's get into him because I think Eagles fans are wondering what they have by the time a lot of people listen to this, maybe over the next day or two. We're going to get a chance to see him on the field, ironically, against the Bills in the next preseason game. How good of a player is this? You've covered him now for a couple of years. You said he took a step back last year. What are the Eagles getting in Ronald Darby?
At his best, Ronald Darby has the ability to be a really strong, man-to-man cornerback, who can tackle really well and who can really line up against number one wide receivers. He showed that, even as a rookie, the game wasn't too big for him. He's got a ton of speed. He's really physical. I was surprised at how well he tackles. But last year it seemed like, he was a little bit in over his head. It was weird to see him take a step back. I can't really explain why it happened. I don't know if he, wasn't preparing as well as he was before or, what exactly it was. Maybe teams were, seeing some things on film and targeting him a bit more often. They also had some injuries they were dealing with in the secondary, so there were some communication issues throughout the season. But Darby wasn't quite the same player. That said, in Jim Schwartz's defense, playing man-to-man coverage, he has all the tools that you need in a cornerback in that defense, to play on the boundary. So I think there's a chance he'll bounce back and become a pretty decent player for the Eagles. I never saw him as, a guy that will develop into a, lockdown cornerback that you mentioned, with the Richard Shermans and Patrick Petersons of the world. But I do think, he has the ability to be a solid starter out on the boundary and at the very least a reliable number two guy.
So we know the Bills made a big change. Obviously, Sean McDermott's the head coach now, no more Rex Ryan. He's a good player, the way you're describing him. We'll see how good he could become over the course of his career. But you mentioned expendable. Tre'Davious White, they took in the first round. Do you think it says something about Darby that they were willing to trade him away? Still a young player, still a couple years left, new coach, a defensive coach. Is it a knock on him that Sean McDermott didn't think he was necessary to this defense, or the GM, Bean, didn't think he was necessary? Or is this just business here and he wasn't going to fit in long term?
Yeah, it could definitely say something about him. I mean, Peter King reported that, he didn't exactly fit in with the new culture, that Sean McDermott was trying to build. I don't know, if that's entirely true. There's probably some level of truth to it. But at the same time, I think this also boils down to a business move for the Bills. They needed to replace Watkins because they do still want to compete in 2017, or at least that's what they're saying. But they also wanted to continue to build for the future. And this gave them a chance to do a little bit of both. They picked up the third-round pick, and they got a wide receiver who they think can, be at least, 80% of Watkins, if not, completely replace him. So I think it was mostly business. Darby was, a valuable asset. If you want to get a valuable asset in return, you have to give up somebody that has some worth. And I think Darby had a lot of worth to the Eagles. You mentioned, they had some issues at cornerback, so they were looking to address that position. So it made sense from a lot of different ways for both teams. But, in terms of it saying something about Darby, I'm not entirely sure. I can say I think he'll fit in there with some familiar faces on that defense in Philadelphia, a lot of former Bills there. So I think he'll fit in, and I think he'll stay in line. I don't think he was ever much of a problem in Buffalo.
Yeah, that's it. You mentioned the familiar face. There's a lot. I'm assuming you're heading down to Philadelphia for the game Thursday. We do this podcast on a Wednesday, day before the Eagles-Bills game. Corey Graham just came over about a week ago. Nigel Bradham there. It is an interesting way things have broken here. Obviously, Jim Schwartz is the main cog that's bringing some of these guys here, but Darby didn't play for Schwartz. He's, I think, the first one of this group of Bills that have come over recently that doesn't have a tie to Jim Schwartz, but probably fits in his defense. It's kind of unique what we're seeing here, Matthew, with all these former Bills now playing for the Eagles.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And, this is just the latest example. You mentioned all those guys sort of just followed, Jim Schwartz when he got the job. It was kind of cool to see, especially considering the level of success they had back in 2014 when Jim Schwartz was the defensive coordinator here. But, he doesn't have the most talented pieces from that 2014 defense, but he does have a few of the guys that helped make it work. I thought Nigel Bradham was particularly good in that defense and, really enjoyed playing in it. And I think a lot of the guys liked playing in that defense as opposed to the one that came after it with Rex Ryan. So I think, a guy like Corey Graham being there helps out Ronald Darby a lot, a familiar face in the secondary, a guy who is experienced and can show him the ropes a little bit, can show him what it's like, to step into a new locker room and sort of acclimate yourself. It's nice to have a guy that around. It's not easy to switch teams in the middle of training camp, in the middle of the preseason, but, to have a few of those guys around, I think can't hurt Darby at all.
Before we get into Matthews, and I want your perspective, and I'll give you mine at the player that's going back to Buffalo in this deal. What was your thought? You said earlier you were shocked and surprised when the deal went down and the two deals went down for Buffalo. The thing that stood out to me was both the Bills and the Eagles. I know the Eagles did because I watched the game. I think I heard the Bills did as well, used the players traded in their first preseason game pretty regularly early in the game. I know the first couple passes for the Eagles, it was thrown to Jordan Matthews. I think Sammy Watkins had a very similar situation there. Do you think the coaching staff in Buffalo was aware that something big might go down? I don't believe the coach in Philadelphia really knew what was going on. I think this was all above him and upstairs. Do you think Sean McDermott knew that Darby might be gone, and more specifically Watkins, before everything happened on last Friday?
According to Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott did not know that they had a deal in place before the game. He waited until after the game to tell him, that Sammy Watkins, there was a deal that, they had tentatively agreed to with Sammy Watkins. He obviously wanted to get McDermott's approval and take the night to sleep on it before they pulled the trigger. But he said he waited until after the game so that McDermott wouldn't be distracted by it. But it is a funny little coincidence that Sammy Watkins was targeted on the first 3 plays that the Bills offense ran, and he caught all 3 passes, looked really good, looked healthy. You wonder if maybe they were saying, giving LA one last look at Watkins just to show them that he was healthy before, pulling the trigger on the deal. But I don't think McDermott necessarily knew. I assume he was clued into the possibility. I doubt that Thursday night after the game was the first time Brandon Beane ever mentioned the idea of trading Watkins or Darby. So he probably knew in the back of his head, but I don't necessarily think it factored into the game plan too much, especially considering, Tyrod Taylor was not clued in on what was going on, and it didn't seem like Watkins was either.
Matthew Fairburn joining us here on the Eagles podcast we do for NJ.com here. And Matthew, I'm interested in your perspective on Jordan Matthews, the guy coming back to Buffalo, and really what fans think him up there that you've heard so far, because I have watched every game he's played for 3 years in the NFL. I think he's a good player, could be very good at times. I think he's reliable, even though you might hear he drops some passes, and he has had some drops. But I think he's one of only 14 receivers in the league since he came in the league 3 years ago to play at least 45 games and catch at least 225 passes. He basically suits up every week, and he will get open, and he will move the chains. I think he's a good player. I think the Eagles are underestimating how much he meant to them, and I think they might miss him. What's your perception of the player, and what if Buffalo Bills fans think right now?
Well, Buffalo Bills fans are a little disappointed right now because 15 minutes into his first practice, he suffered a chip fracture in his sternum, and he's going to miss a few weeks. But it sounds like he's going to be ready for week 1, and I think he's a guy, like you mentioned, a guy that can be a reliable player for them and still produce, give them production at that position. I mean, each and every year in the league, since he and Sammy Watkins entered the league, Jordan Matthews has had more catches than Watkins has, and that doesn't necessarily mean Matthews is a better player. I think Watkins is the more talented receiver, but he's also, a guy that's often hurt. And, he missed 8 games last year. He's missed 13 since he entered the league. So the fact that Matthews can stay on the field, at least, traditionally he's been able to stay on the field. He's not on the field right now, but I think, the only question I have about it is they now have their top 3 receivers are all really good out of the slot. So 2 of those guys have to play on the outside. My guess is that it will be, Zay Jones and maybe Matthews playing on the outside when the dust settles and Matthews is healthy. But I think they'll all, kind of move around a little bit. It'll be interesting to see how they use them. I think Matthews is a really solid player. I don't know what they think of him long term, whether they'll want to bring him back, when his contract runs up after the year, or how they view all of that. But it seems like they're getting a guy who's going to be great for the locker room. He's going to be dependable, as you mentioned, and he's a guy who can actually stretch the field, make big plays. He's a big body, something that they don't have in their other 2 receivers. So I think he's a guy that Tyrod Taylor is going to like having. And I get the sense that, he'll give them some production that maybe they missed a little bit when Watkins was out. So they now have a very different looking wide receiver room, and they have to figure things out in a hurry because week 1 is coming up faster than they know it, and Matthews is already hurt. So they have a lot to figure out in the next few weeks.
Yeah, they do. I mean, assuming Matthews is healthy and gets himself healthy and gets in the field, I think Bills fans are going to like him. He's reliable. He's good. He moves the chains. I agree with you on the quarterback thing. I think Tyrod Taylor is going to like him. Carson Wentz loved him, both on the field and off. They were very close. Carson, in fact, drove him to the airport to say goodbye. I mean, it was a move that wasn't totally well received in the Eagles locker room, even though I think they understood what they got back might make it worth it. Now, you mentioned long-term with Matthews, and we don't know what the Bills are going to re-sign him or not. But the 3rd-round pick I found interesting in this deal, too, because when I first saw it, I said, okay, Darby, Matthews, and I could see why the deal would work for both sides. But the Bills are also getting a 3rd-round pick back. What do you think mattered more to the Bills in this deal? The 3rd-round pick they got back, considering what they're trying to do with all the picks they have in next year's draft, or Matthews?
That's an interesting question. I think the draft pick was important to finalize the deal, but I don't know that the deal happens without Matthews because they didn't want to send a message to the locker room that they were completely throwing in the towel on the 2017 season. And Brandon Beane even said he's not entirely sure whether either one of these 2 trades would have happened if both weren't, agreed upon. And so I think it was very important to them to get a player like Jordan Matthews back. He's, you mentioned, how well liked he was in the Eagles locker room. I think that's very important to Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane as they try to establish a culture that, they hope will be different than the last, decade and a half here in Buffalo. So, they wanted a guy like that to come back. They didn't want it to just be draft picks for Darby. So, both pieces were important. Obviously, both of these moves were with an eye toward the future. I don't think anybody is thinking that the Bills got better, for 2017 by making these moves. But, they wanted to compete in 2017, but also continue to stockpile draft picks, which they've done. They now have 6 picks in the first 3 rounds of the 2018 draft. So they have a lot of ammo to work with and a lot of flexibility heading into next offseason, depending on what they decide to do. But Matthews was a very, very critical part of this. And once he gets back on the field, I think he's a guy that they're going to lean on a lot.
Matthew, we'll wrap up with a couple of questions off of people that used to be, former Eagles, guys that were part of this franchise with Philadelphia for a long time in different capacities. LeSean McCoy, what's been your experience covering him and the player he's been? I look at, from afar what he's done. He seems to me like the LeSean McCoy that left Philadelphia. He still produces, had a big year last year. I wonder how he thinks of the rebuild that's going on, because although he continues to defy decline, even though he's getting up there in carries and years, I imagine he can't be thrilled if this team doesn't play well this year, because I don't know how many more years left at a very high level LeSean McCoy has. What's it been like covering him, and what do you think he still has in him?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think LeSean McCoy is still one of the most talented backs in football. He showed that last year. He had just a great year for a team that, struggled to move the ball a lot of the time. He was their workhorse, and he put up great numbers and was really reliable for them after fighting through some injuries the year before. So it's funny because, heading into this offseason, this spring, it seemed like LeSean McCoy was happier than he's ever been in Buffalo. He obviously wasn't happy to get traded to the Bills initially. Chip Kelly didn't, clue him in on it. And, he spent his whole life in Pennsylvania. He gets up to Buffalo. He wasn't exactly a joy to work with at that point, and I think he would even admit that. I don't think he was extremely happy to be there. The first year was a bit of a grind for him because of a few injuries. Last year, he seemed a bit more comfortable, but once Sean McDermott got to Philadelphia, a guy that he was familiar with, he just seemed really happy in Buffalo this spring, but he didn't seem overly thrilled by these trades. I think a lot of guys in the Bills locker room were a little bit caught off guard, that one of the most talented players on their roster, and Sammy Watkins, was sent out of town. LeSean McCoy made no mistake about it. He said, when you grade Watkins versus Matthews, it's pretty obvious who's better. And he said he could relate to Watkins, getting traded for someone who isn't as good as him, which is referring to EJ Gaines, the corner that got sent over from LA. So he was pretty sour on the moves. And, like you mentioned, he doesn't have a ton of years left. He thinks he can play at this level or, play in the league until he's 33 years old. He's chasing 12,000 yards. He's chasing the Hall of Fame, which I think is within reach for him. But in terms of years where he's at the height of his game, we are probably looking at a couple more at most. And everything else the Bills did this offseason suggested that they were going to try to get to the playoffs. They brought back Tyrod Taylor. They brought back Kyle Williams. They brought back Lorenzo Alexander. But these moves sort of ran counter to that. And I think LeSean McCoy's been around long enough that he saw through that and understands, what's going on around him. So I don't think that he's thrilled, but I don't expect that to impact his performance in any way because he has personal goals that he's chasing in addition to the team goals. So I still think he's going to have a big year. I think he still has a couple more big years in him. He doesn't take a ton of direct, huge contact because of the way he plays the position. So I'm expecting pretty big things from McCoy this year.
Yeah, I've stopped counting out LeSean because, and I often say it here, I say he's on the path to the Hall of Fame, and it's ironic because all the Bills that have come and played here, the one big-time Eagle that got to Buffalo, the Eagles still haven't replaced LeSean McCoy. They're still got a back-by committee, which might work for them, but they have not replaced the player they traded away a couple years ago. Matthew, we'll wrap with this. Sean McDermott, the head coach of the Buffalo Bills, gets his chance after all those years in Carolina. He had the 1 year as a defensive coordinator with the Eagles. I thought he got a raw deal. I thought Andy Reid at that point of his tenure was pressured into making a move, even though a young defensive coordinator did a pretty good job with a very undermanned unit at that point in Philadelphia. He's obviously earned his stripes. What's been your impression of McDermott so far, his first training camp and now into his first preseason?
Yeah, I think he has the makeup to be a pretty solid head coach. It's obviously hard to tell until a guy coaches, regular season games and you start to see the results unfold. But, I think he weathered the storm pretty nicely this offseason. He came into a situation that wasn't the best. The Bills haven't made the playoffs in 17 years. They had a GM throughout the spring who was kind of a lame duck and eventually got fired after the draft. So McDermott did a good job kind of coming in here and making one Bills drive his own. He's set up a lot of, he's changed a lot of things there physically, in terms of how the place is decorated. He's changed how they practice. He's changed a lot. He's making it his own and he's doing things his way, which is what you have to do as a head coach. It's funny that you bring up, when he got fired by the Eagles, because he talked to us about that before they broke for the summer, about how, Andy Reid told him it was gonna help him and it was gonna, sort of be for his own good type of thing. And it ended up being true because, he was able to work with Ron Rivera for a while and sort of get out of Andy Reid's shadow a little bit. He grew up in the Philadelphia area and, grew up an Eagles fan and got to work for Andy Reid, and sort of worked his way up really fast and maybe needed to go somewhere else to reach that next level of his development as a coach. So I think, he's still tremendously close with Andy Reid, still considers him one of his mentors. And, obviously his time in Philadelphia had a huge impact on what he does, in Buffalo. He has adopted a lot of what Andy Reid did in Philadelphia, obviously mixing in some of what he learned in Carolina. But I think all of that sets him up, to be, a pretty good head coach. We'll see what happens. Obviously you need the roster to do it, and they're working on trying to clean some things up with this roster. But in terms of his approach and, his pulse on the locker room, I think he's off to a pretty good start.
Yeah, and I know a lot of Eagles fans, Matthew, will be watching because there are a lot of people that were puzzled and upset that McDermott didn't at least get an interview with the Eagles a couple years ago now, when Doug Peterson got the job. They didn't bother to interview Sean McDermott, and a lot of people want him to come back, but obviously wishing him the best now. Matthew, really appreciate you giving us a few minutes on the podcast this week. Enjoy the trip to Philadelphia, and we'll be reading you, Syracuse.com and upstate New York.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
You got it. Appreciate it. Thanks again to Matthew for joining us there and giving us some insights on the trade, on Darby, Sean McDermott, McCoy. I agree with him that McCoy's really on the path to the Hall of Fame for a couple more years. So it's weird. The Eagles and Bills are connected now for a lot of players and coaches, and obviously this trade we'll be talking about this for a while. And I know Matt and Elliot did a podcast recently where they talked about the trade and broke it down and debated each side of it. I'm on the side of this wasn't as big of a slam dunk as many are making it out to be. I like Jordan Matthews a lot. I think he's a good player. I don't think he's irreplaceable. My fear with this trade is more about what the Eagles have at wide receiver. It maybe isn't quite what it looks like or looked like in the first preseason game. You look the last couple of years, Alshon Jeffrey has not been reliable. He doesn't play. He gets hurt or he's suspended. Torrey Smith, I think a lot of us are assuming he's going to bounce back. I loved Torrey Smith when he was in Baltimore. He was a big play threat. I think he'll be better with a good quarterback in Carson Wentz. But he was bad in San Francisco, and we're all just pretending that he wasn't, and he's going to be fine. And then you go to a guy like Nelson Aguilar, who was one of the worst starting wide receivers or wide receivers that played last season in the NFL. Had a good camp. He has impressed everyone. I went out there to a couple practices. I saw Elliot, I saw Matt, watched the guy, and he was making plays, and he looks good. But until he does it in a game that matters, we have to be skeptical that he can do it and he could put it all together. And then Matt Collins, the rookie wide receiver out of North Carolina, had the big catch and the run and the touchdown against the Packers. But again, he has a long way to go, and he had an injury history at North Carolina. So when I look at the deal, I think that they gave up a reliable wide receiver. Was he great? No. Did he drop the ball? Sometimes, yes. But he played in 45 games the last 3 years, caught 225 passes. That's not easy to just replace if everything goes right with the Eagles wide receiving core. Jeffrey is an all-pro type, or at least a Pro Bowl type. Torrey Smith is what he was in Baltimore. Aguilar's ready to play like the first-round pick he was, and Matt Collins makes a play every once in a while and can contribute, then they will get by, and they won't need Jordan Matthews, who probably wasn't going to be here anyway long-term. But I have this fear that we're going to be watching the Eagles in Week 6, and you have Alshon Jeffrey banged up and not playing after a preseason and a training camp where he barely got on the field with the rest of the team. You have Torrey Smith not getting open, and you're relying on Nelson Aguilar and Matt Collins. And I think at that point, the Eagles would miss Jordan Matthews. You throw in the fact that he was loved in that locker room, from Ertz to Burton to Carson Wentz. I think some are discounting the chemistry that was subtracted from the Eagles locker room in this. And none of my reservations about this are about Darby, the player. I think he's probably going to be exactly what Matthew Fairburn described, a good player, may not have shut down one, but he'll make a difference on the Eagles defense. And if he plays up to his standards of his rookie year, they're going to be a top 10 defense. They were 13th last year. They could make a leap with the better pass rush and with at least one better corner. So I get that part of it. I would like this deal so much more if it was Matthews for Darby, just 1-for-1, because then it would be my surplus for your surplus type of thing, and my extra guy for your extra guy. But the Eagles also give up a 3. And I just feel like the Eagles are trying to bridge that build through the draft, but win now thing, and do both at the same time. It's hard. And next year they don't have a 2 or a 3. So it's going to be a lot of pressure on whoever they take in the first round. And it's going to be a lot of pressure on hitting 4th-round picks, which the success rate there it's not easy. So this trade could work. If Ronald Darby's really good and their wide receivers that they still have are, all live up to their potential, live up to what the Eagles think they're going to be, then it's fine. And the trade probably will work out, and the Eagles will be in this thing all year because of what they did. But if they have injuries at wide receiver, or the play of these guys they have isn't great and it's more like it was last year, well, things are going to work out as well. And there'll be a lot of pressure on Darby to be a tremendous player. Everyone, thank you guys for listening to this week's podcast. We will be back soon. I'm sure Elliot and Matt will be bringing you a ton of stuff after the game against the Buffalo Bills. And then, of course, to come here with the 3rd preseason game, the 4th one. We're not that far away. Cut down day and the start of the regular season, September 10th against the Redskins, will be here very soon. Thank you all for listening to the No Huddle Show right here on NJ.com.